In 1911, the Manitoba government initiated plans for the construction of a provincial symbol, one that would act as a beacon of hope for settlers on the western frontier and inspire credence in the province's future. The construction of Manitoba's third legislative building would span nearly a decade. It would withstand political scandal, a ballooning price tag, and a war that threatened to tear the world apart. The sound of a cannon blast declared the opening session of Manitoba's first legislative building. It was 1871 in the little village of Winnipeg, which had recently been named the provincial capital. In 1873, the building was destroyed by fire. After a decade of governing without an official home, the province's second legislative building was opened. It was stately and elegant, and destined to be the center of provincial government through a period of unprecedented growth. The village of Winnipeg alone, which in 1871 had only 241 residents, had, by 1911, swelled to over 136,000. Visions of grandeur swept the province, and the current parliament buildings were deemed insufficient. Then, everyone learned about the new legislative building projects in Regina and Edmonton, buildings that promised to be bigger and better than that of Manitoba. Premier Rodman P. Roblin was not about to be outdone. In November of 1911, his government announced an architectural competition for a new legislative building. Of the 67 sketches submitted to the competition, 5 finalists were selected. The winning design was the work of Frank Worthington Simon and Henry Boddington III of Liverpool, England. At 220,000 square feet, the enormous Beaux-Arts structure would dwarf the existing legislative building it was being built alongside. $2 million were allocated for the project, a vast sum at the time, but Simon and Boddington were promised that even more money would be available if necessary. With everything moving forward as planned, no one guessed the troubles that lay ahead for the new building. The senior architect of the Manitoba Legislative Building project was Frank Simon. He has been credited, even by his partner Henry Boddington, as the creative force behind the building's design. In his youth, Simon had traveled to Paris and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, where he met his mentor, renowned architect Jean-Louis Pascal. Simon's studies under Pascal provided him with the skills which would later become crystallized in the Manitoba Legislative Building.
The École des Beaux-Arts was a place where you learned the vocabulary of traditional architecture. And in the 19th century, that vocabulary included not just the classical, but also the medieval and all its various ranges and formulations, and even the Egyptian. There was quite a mania for Egyptian motifs. Obviously, you weren't creating your own forms or your new columns. You were using traditional columns and often using them in ways that were fairly standard. But the purpose was to have this vocabulary that you could work with so that then you could take the past and the components of the past and you could make something better.
In August of 1913, a stone's throw from the existing Parliament building, excavation began. Simon and Boddington had set up office in Winnipeg, where Boddington would remain year-round. Simon would spend his winters in England. But neither of the men were named supervising architect, a decision Simon found baffling. His intimate knowledge of the plans would have saved time and money. Yet the work went forward without him. Almost immediately, officials began to worry about the building's foundation. Simon's plans had the building supported mostly by piles, along with several giant concrete-filled caissons in the middle that reached down to the bedrock to support the massive central dome. But local engineers said caissons should be used throughout the entire structure to prevent it from sinking into the ground, the unfortunate fate of a grain elevator constructed the previous year. Winnipeg contractor Thomas Kelly had won the legislative building contract. Kelly agreed with the plan to change the piles to caissons. He also thought steel frame construction would be a better choice than reinforced concrete. But all these changes came with a hefty price tag, and by the beginning of 1914, costs soared to $3.7 million. In August, war was declared in Europe. Fear of material shortages and rising prices gripped the project as Canada prepared for its role in the conflict. Roblin's government called a special war session of the Legislative Assembly. In hope of finishing sooner, they decided to accelerate construction, a move that shoved the building's price tag past the $5 million mark, more than doubling its proposed cost. But this was just the beginning. Though Thomas Kelly had submitted the lowest contracting bid, many of the individual prices he quoted for materials were radically different than the competing bid. Simon had been suspicious of the quote, but excluded from the office of supervising architect, he could do little but warn the government to keep a close eye on Kelly. Back at the construction site, things weren't adding up. Kelly had been receiving large payments, advances unusually far ahead of schedule, for work that had barely begun. Workers were severely underpaid, and contracts went missing. Then materials began to mysteriously disappear and reappear at other construction sites around the city. Pillars, suspiciously similar to those intended for the Legislative Building, were seen to grace Thomas Kelly's new residence only a few blocks from the Legislative Building site. Everyone was growing impatient with the government's use of public money. The project had become too expensive, and the people demanded accountability. It was all too much for T.C. Norris, leader of the Liberal Opposition Party. He demanded a royal commission to investigate. Kelly was called to the stand and furiously defended his work, urging officials to examine the construction site, insisting the work would speak for itself. It did. Kelly's concrete was later found to be substandard at best, and many of the caissons didn't reach bedrock. Furthermore, Kelly adamantly refused to produce records for any of his transactions. For Roblin, the writing was on the wall. He handed in his resignation as Premier of Manitoba, passing the reins of power to T.C. Norris. Now acting Premier T.C. Norris vowed that justice would prevail over the scandal. Immediately, Thomas Kelly was dismissed as project contractor and criminal charges were pressed against him. Kelly fled to the United States, was tracked down in Chicago, and brought back to Manitoba. He spent 2 years in prison while his home and land were repossessed as payment to the Crown. When Simon made his annual return voyage to Winnipeg in the spring of 1915, he was shocked at the poor state of his building. There were extensive structural problems. Large cracks had formed in the building's foundation and would require repair immediately. Simon pleaded with the Norris government to let him take over as supervising architect, and this time he got his wish. At long last, the building's architect would join the multitude of employees at the construction site. A new contractor, J. McDermott and Company, was appointed, whose every action would now be scrutinized by Simon's watchful eye. Once again, the construction of Manitoba's Legislative Building gained momentum. Every day, hundreds of men worked at the construction site, and the building began to quickly take shape. Simon's first order of business was to cut the escalating costs while keeping his original design specifications. He changed the roof of the dome from stone to copper and eliminated several decorative elements. Simon's original designs had called for interior walls made of expensive Portland stone, which was now out of the question. Instead, he settled for Manitoba Tyndall stone. The list of changes went on and on, but Simon had largely remained true to his original design while managing to save around $1 million. The project was already way over budget, and repairing Kelly's faulty craftsmanship was going to be expensive. More and more problems with Kelly's work were surfacing. He had consistently overcharged for work which had been sometimes substandard and other times not performed at all. Despite all of this, construction of Manitoba's legislative building was moving along smoothly. For many, the project had become a lifeline, a means of employment. Skilled workers applied their trade to the building day and night, using a mixture of modern and traditional building techniques. Much of the work was done by hand, using methods which would soon be abandoned in the wake of new technology and design trends. But all of that lay in the future as the new legislative building was brought to fruition. Feeling that things were back on track, it was now time for Simon to focus his attention on decorating the magnificent building inside and out. Once again, Simon looked to Paris, where at the advice of his mentor, Jean-Louis Pascal, he contacted sculptor Georges Garde. For Garde's credentials, one needed to look no further than Paris's famed Alexander III Bridge, where Garde had crafted massive lions to guard the entryway. Simon began corresponding with Garde and commissioned him to create 2 life-size bison which would flank the grand staircase, to create decorative statue for the legislative chamber, and construct what would become Manitoba's most recognizable symbol for the top of the dome.
I think Simon, in looking at his design, decided that he needed a figure up there. I guess he decided maybe enough female allegorical figures, because there are a number also around the upper ranges of the building. And so he says to Garde in a letter that I think I'd like to have a male rather than a female allegorical figure, and didn't even at that point specify that it should be some symbol of progress or anything.
The bronze statue was first named Eternal Youth, but it would later be known only as the Golden Boy. It would measure 16 feet from torch to toe and weigh over 1,600 kilograms. Careful attention was paid to the statue's support shaft, a specifically engineered central support post which would lock the statue safely in place over the dome. But there was a more pressing threat to the welfare of the statue than prairie wind, which no one had planned for and would take everyone by surprise. By late July 1918, steel girders for the upper dome were in place, the last of which weighing around 53 tons. They had been hoisted to a height of 108 feet. One observer proclaimed that never in North America had girders of such weight been hoisted to such a height. Meanwhile, a minor public event had occurred. A month earlier, a small group had gathered on the building's new roof to observe and photograph an eclipse of the sun. Though the event received little fanfare, it was one of the earliest public gatherings to use the new parliament. At last, Manitobans looked to the sky, for the first time, beyond the soaring monolith of the unfinished dome. Soon, the war in Europe would reach its conclusion, and a new era with new challenges would begin. Then from France came a spectacular story about Georges Garde's Golden Boy. The foundry where the statue was forged had been bombed and was badly damaged. Luckily, the statue had survived the attack completely unscathed. It was taken to port and lowered into the hold of a cargo ship to cross the ocean. But the ship was commandeered for the war and spent 2 years crisscrossing the Atlantic with the Golden Boy in its hold before finally unloading the statue in New York. In November of 1919, Georges Garde's Golden Boy was hoisted to the top of the building's dome, the crowning element of the new legislative building. The building was officially opened on July 15, 1920, the 50th anniversary of the province of Manitoba. In a speech, T.C. Norris paid tribute to the early pioneers of Winnipeg, who he said were men of courage and foresight. They laid the foundations of the splendid city Winnipeg is today. Standing in the background behind the premier was an old white-haired man, an early immigrant to the city, who was heard to say, "Thank you." As the official opening of the building approached, Frank Simon had spent his time scrutinizing every minute detail, often to the chagrin of those who fell victim to his dwindling temper. In the library, Simon declared that the wrong color tones had been used and demanded the entire room be repainted. When that was done, he complained about a single volume of books that was too light in color and didn't match the new paint. He requested that they be removed from the room completely. Soon, Frank Simon's work would be complete, but in the meantime, the heart of the building had leapt to life. The Legislative Chamber hosted its first assembly of the provincial government in early 1920. Mural artist Augustus Vincent Tack believed attractive decoration in a legislative chamber would inspire politicians to the highest ideals, and the results would be reflected in their leadership. Tack had yet to attach his murals to the ceiling at the first sitting. The final cost of the building was released later that year, over $9 million, almost 5 times the original price estimated. Interest incurred would reach almost $14 million more, and the debt wouldn't be retired until 1954. Still, despite the outrageous cost of the building, few visitors were critical of its effect.
Well, I think in general, people were really blown away by it, that it was this great structure that, if they were immigrants, reminded them of buildings in grand cities that maybe they'd either lived in or passed through. And now Manitoba had one, and it was confirmation, if they were longtime residents, of their efforts, having a culmination in this grand structure which represented progress. And if they weren't longtime residents, I think it represented to them that they'd come to a civilized place where government functioned and they could make a life. It can have other levels of meaning, and a lot of that has to do with one's tendency to investigate or believe in different kinds of symbolism. You can see it as a reflection of something much larger, some cosmology that links it to mystical or spiritual traditions. But in a more practical sense, it's a very clear symbol of the stability of the government, and this building was a symbol of their progress.
After the building was officially opened, one important detail remained to be added. Simon had engaged British painter Frank Bragwin to create a mural commemorating the struggles and sacrifice of the Great War. Hanging prominently in the rotunda for all visitors to see, the painting, which had been conceived almost as an afterthought, would become one of the building's most celebrated elements.
A detail of it, which seems maybe just like space filler at the bottom, is in fact very much a sort of ordinary symbol, like flowers blooming. Well, that's not an obscure symbol you need to have a classical education for, but it's a very hopeful sort of symbol that after all of this, the interrupting of the plowing and all the events of war, the explosions, the destruction of buildings, that flowers will grow again. And so right at the front of the mural, you have flowers growing again.
The building was to be the last major commission of Frank Simon's career. Upon its completion, he returned to Europe, disappearing into relative obscurity. The Manitoba Legislative building would be the crowning achievement of his career as an architect, and a legacy in stone for generations to come.
Time will prove whether a building is well built, whether it lasts, the material is well chosen. Siting is very important. Many a good public building is crowded somewhere because of commercial demands on space. This one has been duly recognized as an important building and given respect in its setting. There's a dignity about it. There's a statement that it's not commercial. You know, that anything but commercial. It respects the public image and the public nature and the public setting. It has tradition about it, but it still lives with the present and lives with the contemporary age.